All right. Welcome everyone to the Madison Fabric User Group for October 2025. We get together once a month and we talk about all the things latest and greatest inside of Microsoft Fabric, and we have featured speakers that come and help us to understand more about this ecosystem. Today we have Ben Kiesau. Ben is a consultant over at Baker Tilly. He's going to be talking about embedded analytics. This is a passion project and topic of mine. Ben, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm senior consultant at Baker Tilly. Been there about 3 years, mostly doing kind of data engineering work for our clients. Based out of our Chicago office currently, although I will actually be moving back to Madison in about a month. So excited for that. And excited
Welcome
to be
back.
here today.
Yes. Welcome back, sir. All right, Ben, you're going to be talking about embedded analytics. Yes?
Yes.
Awesome. Can you tell us, before we jump into it, how did you get started with embedded analytics? How did this come to be?
Sure. Yeah, it actually started probably over a year ago now, maybe even close to two. Um, Chris has actually reached out to me about starting an internal project to look into doing embedded Power BI in applications. So I had done some work then and created a little demo app to embed Power BI reports for internal users within your own organization. And now currently on a client project that we're working on, we are trying to embed Power BI report into an application for external users outside of the organization. So started looking into that facet of embedded, and that's what I'm going to be focused on today.
Fantastic, Ben. Now, I was part of a team that built out one of the first embedded analytics about 10 years ago. It took a pro developer like 9 to 12 months to build out an embedded analytics application at that point in time. Ben, how long did it take you um, to build out that embedded application, that first beta test that you did?
Um, well, it took a little bit because it was on the side of all my client work and everything. But if you just put all the hours together, it probably would add up to a couple of weeks with the new technology and everything that they've got out now.
Yeah, it is much, much easier. So as we go through what Ben is showing us, remember that like what we're talking about here is a project that's a few weeks or a month or two at the most. Really, if you're talking a month or two of work, you're really not getting into the technology side that's dragging it out. It's going to be UI and design conversations that will drag out that build. Is that a fair assessment, Ben?
For sure. Yeah, like I'll show a demo app I built, very simple, bare bones. Probably took a day or two to stand that up.
Fantastic. All right, Ben, why don't you jump into it? Show us what you got.
All right. Sounds good. So start with the agenda real quick. I'm going to give a little bit of background and context around the project that we're doing this on, and talk about how data ownership impacts how you're doing embedded. So kind of alluded to that. There's some things that are different when you're doing it internally versus externally. So I'll cover that and then talk about steps for implementing this type of solution and what an architecture might look like. And then finally, before the demo, talk about how you can still do row level security even when you're doing this for users that are outside of your organization. So quick context on client project that we're currently working on. We're working with a franchising system of restaurants. So they have all these franchisees who are technically external to the organization. So they're not going to have direct access into the data warehouse that we have internally. So the way that they're currently exposing data is through a third-party application that they've purchased and some Excel reports. And those things are pretty limited in terms of what they can display and how much control the company has over what they're showing the franchisees there and giving them more freedom to do analytics on their restaurants. So if we can embed Power BI reports into this application, that can drastically help them out with their analytic capabilities. So data ownership, when you're doing Power BI embedded, there's kind of two different scenarios. One where the app owns the data and one where the user owns the data. So app owns data is for external users, user owns data is for internal users. And when you're doing this internally, you're going to have these users set up in Microsoft Entra. So they're going to need their own individual Power BI licenses, and basically whatever they can access in the Power BI service normally, they could access through your embedded application. And then any authentication or row-level security can be handled through Microsoft Entra as well. Whereas when you're doing this for external users, they're not going to have Power BI licenses individually. So what matters is on the workspace where your report lives. There's certain license capacities that will work for embedded and others won't. So you'll need the Power BI embedded or premium SKUs or the Fabric SKU as long as it's F64 or higher. And then when you're doing authentication, that's going to be handled through a server's principal. And then the row-level security, you have to handle through the application logic. There's something called an effective identity that you can pass in when you're getting an embed token, and that allows you to lock down that data access. And then the last difference is with the embedding logic. When you're doing this internally, all you need to do is get an access token for the user, and that pretty much lets you do whatever you need to do, call the Fabric APIs, embed reports. Whereas with the app owns data situation, you get an access token for the service principal, and you can use that for the Fabric APIs, but then for embedding, you have to take one step further and get an embed token for the report that you want to embed. So high level implementation steps for something like this. First thing you have to do is make sure your Power BI workspace has an appropriate license capacity that this will actually work for. And then you're going to create an app registration in Azure, and that would be the service principal that you use for authentication. The next step is somewhat optional, but highly recommended, to create a security group and add the app registration to that group. And where that comes in handy is with step 4 there. There's a couple of settings in Power BI admin console that you need to enable, which you could enable across the organization, but you probably don't want to do that. So just enable that for certain security groups. And that's where you want your app registration to be in one of those. And the two settings you need to enable are to allow service principals to use the Fabric APIs and to allow them to embed reports. Once you have that set up, you can add the app registration to the workspace as at least a member. And then you should be all set up and you can configure your application code to do the embedding. So here's kind of what a sample architecture might look like from a pretty simple view. You got raw data flowing into a data warehouse where you've got your star schema and everything set up. If you're doing row-level security, you're going to need some sort of security table or user access hierarchy in there that you can feed into your semantic model. and whatever reports you want to build out, and set up your security rules for RLS. And then when you're actually configuring your application code, you can leverage the Power BI REST API for a lot of things. So first off, you can get an access token using the credentials from your service principal. And then that allows you to, for example, list reports in the workspace that the service principal has access to and get report details. If you're doing row-level security, you need to create an effective identity for the user. And I'll talk about that a little more on the next slide. But once you have the access token, the report ID, and the effective identity, you can use those three things to get an embed token. And then you pretty much have everything you need to actually embed the report. And I also just want to highlight this dashed box up at the top here. It's not always going to be relevant, but it is relevant for the project that we're working on. If you're working with a third party where usernames, user IDs are coming from their system, you just have to collaborate with them to have them send that over. So in our case, they actually have a user hierarchy built out already on their side. So rather than reinventing the wheel, we're just leveraging that and having them send that to us on a daily basis so we can build out the user access hierarchy from there and use that to drive RLS. So row-level security, when you're doing this for external users, you can accomplish that by passing in that effective identity. That's going to look like that screenshot in the bottom right. Include a username, roles, and data sets. And typically what you would do for external users is you just set up one role called dynamic user or something like that. And then it's really the username that's driving the RLS. And when you're writing the docs for that rule, you can just use that username attribute, and that's going to be whatever was passed in the effective identity. And one important note, if you're working with a model that has RLS set up, you have to pass that effective identity or the embedding will error out. And I'll show that in the demo. And on the flip side of that, if you're using a model that does not have RLS enabled and you pass that effective identity, that's also going to error out. And I'll show that as well.
So Ben, would you say a best practice is to have row-level security on any model that you're sharing out through an embedded app?
You could do that. That would simplify your application code for sure, to where you can just pass an effective identity every time. Otherwise, like in my demo app that I quickly set up, I'm just handling if you include a username, it'll pass the effective identity. If you don't, it won't. And I'll kind of show how I'm handling that. But yeah, I think that would be a good way to handle it, is just have RLS set up on all the reports that you're embedding in the app.
Yeah, I especially like to have it if I'm embedding for external users and external people are going to be consuming my information. I want to make sure that if someone's able to like strip out of my embedded app somehow the URL string for Power BI, they don't somehow inherently like be able to like go in and connect to it without having that authentication in place. This ensures doubly that if I've somehow publicly exposed it, at a bare minimum, I have RLS in place to prevent people from gaining access to the data. So,
Gotcha. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. This is great, though.
Thanks. Yeah. So now that I've covered all of that, just want to get into the demo. But before I do that, I just want to show a model for one of the reports. I built two very simple reports just to show how this works. One that does not have RLS enabled and one that does. This is the model for the one that does have RLS enabled. So it's just a sample data set that I pulled from online somewhere of employee data and just added a very simple department dimension and then this employee data access table, and that's what's driving the row level security. So I set up two users for this, user one and user two. User one, we should see just the IT department, and user two should see both marketing and sales. So we'll test that out. And then on the bottom right there, that's the DAX for the security rule. It's very simple, just using that username attribute and comparing that against your access table. And then that will filter the access table and flow to the dimension from there into your facts. All right, so jump into the demo now. First, I'll just show these in the Power BI service so we know what we should be seeing. This is an interesting data set I found on Kaggle of UFO sightings that have been documented. Just made a very simple report for it. I think it's actually for the whole world, but I filtered it down to the United States in the last 50 years. But this is what that should look like when it's embedded. And then the other one I built out, just a simple employee dashboard. This is the one that I'll focus on more because it uses row level security. And so this department slicer, we should see just the departments that we're supposed to see. I also put a slicer up here for the user IDs, just as like an extra check to where if I'm looking as one of these users or the other, it's just gonna show the one and not both of them. Make sure that that filter is working appropriately. And then here it is in desktop too, that same model. And I showed the DAX already, but you can just see the role here, dynamic user, and then on that table is where I put that rule. So relatively simple on the Power BI side for setting that up. Probably not too different than what you would otherwise be used to.
A quick question, Ben.
Mhm.
You've it's asking, what FSKU capacity do you use to embed for internal users? And what would one consider when deciding an FSKU? Please share your experiences. Do you have any feedback on that, Ben?
Well, my limited feedback would be that I know you need at least F64 for external. I'm not sure whether it's different for internal. I might have to defer to you, Chris.
Yeah, no, it's F64 is your base SKU for sharing internal and external. If you're sharing externally, you can still use the embed SKUs for Power BI are out there. So that is still an option, but most of the time, most companies find that the F64 level SKU makes the absolute most sense, especially now with Fabric and the ability to leverage all the potential compute options inside of Fabric. That makes it infinitely more palatable. So
Thank
there
you.
you go. Yep. Sorry, keep going.
All right, so now I'll jump over into the actual demo app. I'll show some of the code, how it's working under the hood, but first I'll just start it up, start up my backend. I built the backend with Node and the front end with React. But oh, saying the word React as I was typing. But you can do this with whatever languages or frameworks you want to use. Should open up in my browser in a second here. Yeah. Okay, so I just very simple front end that I built here. Put a drop down for my two reports. Um, First look at the one that's not using RLS. And first I'll try this. I'll put in a user ID and I configured the backend to where if I put this here, it'll include that effective identity just to show that that doesn't work. It's going to say that it should not have an effective identity if you want to create that embed token. But now I'll try this without that. And we should see that same report that we saw in the service. Yep, there it is. And then you have this embedded here. You can interact with it and everything like you would normally be able to um, in the Power BI service. It's going to work the same way. You might notice that there's no page navigation here or filter pane. And I'll show why that is. It's because it's configured to be that way. Those are things that you can control when you're embedding. And then look at the one that is using row level security. Again, I'll first try without that effective identity. This is not going to work. It's going to say that it requires that to be provided. So I'll try this again with one of the users I set up. This is the one where I should only be seeing the IT department. And yeah, that looks to be working. We just have the IT department there and you can look at any IT employees, but nobody else. And then if you look at the slicer up here, the only user I'm seeing is user one. So obviously wouldn't have that slicer there when I was exposing this to external users, but just to demonstrate that the row level security is working. And it also gives you a way to kind of simulate RLS while you're testing. And then we'll look at this as user two. It's where I should see sales and marketing. And yeah, that is working appropriately. So any marketing employee, any sales employee, and nothing outside of there. And then up here, I'm only seeing user two. So that's all working as expected. And I can kind of jump into the code a little bit. So on the front end, what this is doing when I click that embed button is sending a request to my backend, and that passes in that username and the report ID that I selected there. And then just does some error handling. But if there's no errors, it'll set the embed config with what is returned there. And then it can do the embedding. So I'm using the Power BI JavaScript client library that they have available, just bringing it in through CDN. And they have this embed function included. And it takes two arguments. One is just a container that the report is going to live in. So if you're familiar with app development at all, it's probably just like a div container. And then the second argument is the configuration for the report, which looks like this. So this is where you're going to include your embed token, embed URL, report ID, all of that. If you're doing this internally, you're going to have an access token instead of an embed token. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same configuration. And then here's in the settings where I pointed out that we weren't seeing the page navigation or the filter panes. And that's because I set those to false here. So you can control those type of things. There's quite a few settings you can play with. I think there's a Power BI embedded playground out there online where you can mess around with a lot of different settings with like a sample report that they have, and grab the JSON for it. So A lot of different things you can control there. Um, and also with this embed function that comes with some event handlers. So on load, on render, on error. And that's how you can kind of show like the spinner while you're waiting for it to load and that sort of thing. And then what's happening on the back end when it gets that request, first thing it's going to do is get an access token. So that's just using OAuth 2, and you put in your client ID and client secret from the service principal that you set up. That'll get you your access token. And then with that, you can call on the Power BI APIs. So here I'm just getting the report info for the report that I'm trying to embed using my access token. And that'll give me back the report ID and all the info about the report name, embed URL, all that sort of stuff. And then here's where I'm setting up the embed config, where if I did include a username, it's going to put that identity, otherwise it won't. The access level, I haven't messed around with too much, but view has been appropriate for my use cases so far. But this is the key part when you're doing row level security. This, you include that username and role and data set in the identity. And then you can use the generate token endpoint from the Power BI REST API and include your embed config and your access token for the auth. And that'll get you the embed token. So that's just getting served up to the front end, and that gives me everything I need to do the embedding. And that is essentially everything it takes. And that's kind of everything I had to cover. So if there's any questions, you can take those.
This is fantastic, Ben. UV has another great question. She says, from a resource perspective, should we expand the skill set from just a Power BI/Fabric developer to more of a full stack developer who can set up embedded apps? Or with AI, should we vibe code our way forward?
I won't tell you to vibe code, but I will say I did use AI to help me write this demo app. And of course, reading through it and making sure I understand what it's doing and everything. But it's really kind of cookie cutter code so it is a good use case for Gen AI, in my opinion. And it's fairly simple to set up. So I don't think you necessarily have to be a full stack developer to figure out how to do this. Um, I think kind of anybody with sort of an engineering background or that kind of experience can figure it out.
I will say this definitely falls more into the like kind of piggybacking on what Ben said, is this does fall more into like an engineer type space. So if your team is filled with like self-service, I can do it Power BI people, which are like 98% of Power BI developers, I fully support that. But if you're one of them, this is probably too much of an ask for you to build out. If you're one of the small percentage of Power BI developers that gets into like programming and doing that stuff, UV, you're spot on. You can vibe code your way into getting this up and running, right?
Yeah, and I will add to that, getting the demo app up and running is pretty simple from that perspective. But if you want like an enterprise production ready app that's fully deployed somewhere, that might take a little more expertise in that space.
I am going to call out and Ben, while I do appreciate that, and we do this type of work all the time, creating these embedded apps. While they're not hard, there's a lot that can go into them. So while Ben, you've highlighted how you can build out this app, and you can definitely do it if you're an engineer, you can get it up and running. It's not an insane ask. There are vendors like the Reporting Hub that have fully baked services out there that have like completely and totally built out the embedded solution, and you just piggyback and use their solution. And I mean, it starts as low as $200 a month. It goes all the way up to $1,000 a month. But I mean, some of these higher tiers allows you to like sell your analytics, right? And have external customers that are paying for stuff. So this is another great option for you if you're in this space and you want to do some embedded solutioning. Okay. And we do not make a dime, or I don't make a dime off of Reporting Hub referrals. I don't know if Ben's worked something out or not. But you know, you never know. Maybe he has. I don't think he has. But there's lots of opportunities out there to take on these things. Okay. All right,
Yep.
Ben. Thank you so much for your presentation. As like it's like a parting words. What would be your like magic wand? Wish people knew this about the building out an embedded app, or what would your parting words be for that?
I think the biggest thing, I guess, is just how relatively simple it can be. And I know, like you said, Reporting Hub is a great thing to use, especially if you're building an app that's like dedicated for Power BI reports. But maybe if you have an existing app that you just want to add a report into, knowing how to do this could be very helpful. And it's relatively straightforward once you've figured out the steps that you have to take to do it. So I think just understanding that it's very doable, very possible.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Ben, thank you so much for joining us and presenting. This could be a shorter one this week because you know what? This solution is simpler than what people fear it is. It is a pretty basic thing. Ben has run through the bulk of what's out there. I mean, you could do a ton of stuff in this space, but this is a great introduction to embedding. So we are going to wrap this one up. Do join us next month where we're going to be going deep on showing people all these amazing things you can do with Figma and Power BI design. Scott Jolson, our fearless leader and champion, is going to be showcasing some of these capabilities with some of our other team members. So we will see you next month. All right. And with that, everybody, have the best day ever. We'll see you next month. Peace.
Thank you.